I remember the first time I decided to learn English. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but I didn't realize how difficult it would be. I was excited to start, thinking I could learn quickly. However, when I tried speaking, my mind went blank. I forgot the words I had learned just the day before. It was frustrating, and I felt embarrassed. Every time I tried to talk, the words wouldn't come. My teacher told me to keep practicing, but it didn't feel like enough. I spent hours reviewing vocabulary, but the words seemed to disappear as soon as I needed them. My friends who spoke English fluently would laugh at my mistakes. They meant no harm, but it hurt every time I forgot a word. I tried to memorize new words, but it felt like the more I learned, the less I remembered. The frustration made me question if I would ever be able to speak fluently. Despite everything, I didn't want to give up. I knew there had to be a way to remember the words better. Each day, I would practice speaking aloud, even if no one was around. I told myself that practice was key, but it didn't seem to make any difference. I would look at myself in the mirror, repeating words over and over. "Hello, my name is," I'd say, but then the rest would vanish from my mind. It felt like a never-ending loop of frustration. I wondered why it was so hard for me to remember. My classmates seemed to have no trouble at all. They could talk with ease, never forgetting a word. It made me feel left behind. I tried to mimic their conversations, hoping some of their confidence would rub off on me. But no matter how hard I tried, my words wouldn't come out the way I wanted them to. I wished I could speak like them. One day, my teacher noticed my struggle and gave me a suggestion. "Try not to memorize too much at once," she said. "Focus on small, simple conversations." I took her advice seriously. Instead of memorizing long lists of words, I began with short phrases. I practiced saying, "How are you?" and "What's your name?" It was a small step, but it made me feel more confident. I started to see progress, even if it was slow. Chapter 2: The Power of Repetition. I realized that repetition might be the key. I started repeating phrases to myself throughout the day. When I was walking to school, I would say, "I am going to school." It felt strange at first, but I got used to it. Saying things aloud helped me hear the words, which made them stick in my mind longer. Even though I still forgot some words, I was remembering more than before. At home, I set up a language practice routine. Every morning, I would spend an hour reviewing vocabulary and phrases. I repeated the same words and sentences over and over, hoping they would stick. By the end of the week, I started feeling more comfortable using simple phrases in conversation. I was no longer as scared of speaking. My teacher encouraged me to keep going. "The more you practice, the better you will get," she said. I found that I was improving, but it wasn't as fast as I hoped. I often became discouraged, especially when I couldn't remember a word I had practiced. It felt like I was taking one step forward and two steps back. But I had learned not to give up. One day, I tried a new approach. I started writing down new words in a notebook and carrying it with me everywhere. Whenever I saw something I didn't know how to say in English, I would write it down and look it up later. This helped me expand my vocabulary little by little. I wasn't fluent yet, but I felt like I was building a strong foundation. As the weeks passed, I began to understand the importance of practice. I wasn't going to become fluent overnight, but if I kept repeating and reviewing, the words would eventually stay in my mind. Slowly but surely, I was improving. Each mistake became a lesson, and every forgotten word was just another opportunity to try again. Chapter 3: The Fear of Speaking. Even though I was learning more words, I still had trouble speaking. Every time I tried to have a conversation, I would forget a word and get stuck. I felt like people were judging me, even though they were just trying to help. I was afraid they would notice how bad my English was. But the truth was, I had nothing to fear. Everyone has to start somewhere. I decided to face my fear head on. I started talking to strangers in English, even if I only knew a few words. "Excuse me, where is the bus stop?" I asked one person. I was nervous, but they smiled and answered me in a friendly way. This gave me confidence. I realized that most people don't mind when you make mistakes. They just want to help. I began to speak to my friends in English more often, even though I still stumbled over words. Sometimes they would correct me, but it didn't bother me anymore. I was learning, and that was what mattered. Over time, I began to feel more comfortable speaking in English. The fear that once held me back started to fade. However, there were still times when I would forget a word mid-sentence. It was embarrassing, but I tried not to let it discourage me. Instead of panicking, I would pause and think for a moment. I learned that it was okay to take my time. The more I practiced, the less I forgot. One thing I realized was that I wasn't the only one struggling. Many of my classmates had similar problems. We all made mistakes, but that was how we learned. I felt better knowing that I wasn't alone. It was comforting to know that everyone was working toward the same goal. Chapter 4: Consistency over Perfection. I had spent so many months trying to be perfect, but I soon learned that perfection wasn't the goal. Instead, consistency was key. I stopped aiming for flawless sentences and focused on improving every day. Every time I spoke, I made sure to say something, even if it was wrong. The more I spoke, the more I learned. My teacher reminded me that making mistakes was part of the process. "Don't worry about being perfect," she said. "The important thing is that you keep trying." I took her words to heart. Slowly, I started to relax more when speaking. I realized that mistakes were just a natural part of learning. I found that my vocabulary was growing more than ever. I had stopped worrying so much about remembering every word. Instead, I focused on understanding the context and the meaning behind what I was trying to say. This made it easier to keep the conversation going, even when I forgot a word. Every day, I try to speak more and more. I spoke to my family, to my classmates, and even to strangers. Each conversation, no matter how small, was a chance for me to practice. It wasn't always easy, but I knew that with time, I would get better. One of the biggest changes was that I stopped translating everything in my head. Instead, I started thinking in English. This made a huge difference in my ability to speak. I wasn't perfect, but I was definitely improving. I realized that learning a language wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. Chapter 5: A New Confidence. As I continued my journey, I started noticing a difference in myself. I was more confident speaking English, even when I made mistakes. I no longer felt embarrassed when I forgot a word. Instead of getting frustrated, I laughed it off and kept going. I had learned that it was okay not to be perfect. One day, I had a conversation with a foreign tourist who didn't speak my language. It was the first time I had used English to communicate without any fear. I made some mistakes, of course, but we understood each other. This was a huge moment for me. I realized that the goal wasn't to speak perfectly, but to be understood. Over time, I became more fluent. The words I had forgotten in the past began to come back to me more easily. I could have longer conversations without getting stuck. My vocabulary was growing, and I was starting to sound more natural when I spoke. I was no longer the shy kid afraid of making mistakes. I continued practicing, but now it felt easier. Speaking English wasn't a struggle anymore. I had learned that language learning was a marathon, not a sprint. It took time, effort, and patience. But the more I practiced, the more confident I became. Looking back, I realized how far I had come. I had started with nothing but a desire to learn, and now I could speak English without fear. I knew that I still had a long way to go, but I was no longer afraid to try. Learning a language was hard, but it was worth every moment of struggle. Chapter 6: Embracing Mistakes. As time went on, I realized that my mistakes were becoming less of a problem and more of an opportunity to grow. I started to embrace them. Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, I started viewing them as stepping stones to success. I realized that every mistake helped me learn something new. I stopped apologizing for forgetting words and just kept talking. The more I spoke, the less I feared making mistakes. One day, a friend pointed out that my pronunciation had improved. I hadn't even noticed it myself, but it felt good to hear. Even though my vocabulary wasn't perfect, I was being understood more clearly. I could now express myself with more confidence, knowing that mistakes were just part of the process. I made a habit of practicing daily, whether I was speaking to someone or thinking in English. At first, it felt forced, but eventually it became natural. I would read books or watch shows in English, mimicking the phrases I heard. I was training my brain to think in English, and it was paying off. Even when I made mistakes in pronunciation or grammar, I didn't mind as much. I had stopped worrying about being perfect. Instead, I focused on how much progress I had made. I was no longer the person who was afraid to speak. I was the person who embraced every chance to practice. The more I used English in everyday situations, the more natural it felt. My confidence grew, and I started to realize that my English wasn't as bad as I once thought. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting better every day. My mistakes no longer held me back. They pushed me forward. Chapter 7: Finding Opportunities to Speak. The next step in my journey was finding more opportunities to speak English. I realized that I could practice every day if I just looked for the right moments. I started speaking with my classmates in English, even if we were just talking about simple things like the weather or our favorite movies. These small conversations helped me practice speaking without the pressure of needing to sound perfect. I also began joining online language exchange platforms where I could practice with native speakers. At first, I was nervous about speaking with people from other countries, but they were kind and patient. They understood that I was learning and were eager to help. Speaking with native speakers was one of the best ways to improve my fluency. I also started attending English-speaking clubs in my town. At these meetings, everyone was there to practice their language skills. It was a safe space where mistakes were expected and welcomed. This made me feel much more comfortable speaking in front of others. I started enjoying these sessions and looked forward to them every week. Each time I spoke English, I felt more confident. My vocabulary expanded, and my understanding of the language improved. I learned to listen carefully, pick up new phrases, and incorporate them into my conversations. The more I practiced, the less I forgot, and the easier it became to form sentences. The opportunities to speak were everywhere. I began to see English as part of my daily life, not something I had to force myself to practice. Whether it was ordering food at a restaurant, talking to a tourist, or chatting with friends, English became a natural part of my routine. I knew I was on the right track. Chapter 8: The Breakthrough Moment. One day, everything clicked. I was having a conversation with a tourist, and for the first time, I didn't have to think about the words before I spoke. The sentences came to me naturally. I didn't struggle to remember vocabulary or worry about making mistakes. I was simply having a conversation, and it felt amazing. It was a moment I had been waiting for. All the hours of practice, all the mistakes, and all the frustrations had led me to this point. For the first time, I felt confident in my English. I didn't care about sounding perfect because I knew I could communicate effectively. I realized that the key to fluency wasn't just about memorizing words or grammar rules. It was about becoming comfortable with the language, embracing the mistakes, and continuing to practice. I had spent so much time worrying about forgetting words, but now I saw that it didn't matter. The important thing was being able to get my message across. That conversation with the tourist was a turning point. After that, I felt much more at ease with speaking English. I wasn't afraid of forgetting words anymore because I knew I could always find a way to express myself. I had become a more confident and fluent speaker. Looking back, I realized that I had come a long way. The boy who was afraid to speak English had transformed into someone who could hold a conversation without hesitation. My journey wasn't over, but I had reached a new level of comfort with the language. Chapter 9: Teaching Others. As I became more confident in my English skills, I realized that I could help others who were struggling just like I had. One day, a friend asked me for advice on learning English, and I happily shared my experiences. I explained the importance of practice, repetition, and not fearing mistakes. I told them that learning a language was a journey, and they should embrace every step of it. It felt good to help others, especially because I knew how difficult it could be to learn a new language. I started tutoring a few classmates who wanted to improve their English. We would practice speaking together, and I would help them with pronunciation and vocabulary. It was rewarding to see their progress. By teaching others, I also continued to reinforce my own knowledge. Every time I explained something, I realized how much I had learned. It was a great way to solidify my skills and give back to those who were just starting their language journey. Teaching became a way for me to continue growing as well. I understood that learning never stopped, and by helping others, I was helping myself. It gave me a new perspective on my progress. What once seemed impossible was now something I could share with others. Through tutoring, I made new friends who were also passionate about learning English. We exchanged tips and techniques for remembering words, and we supported each other in our language learning. It felt great to be part of a community of learners who shared the same goals. Chapter 10. Looking ahead. Now, as I reflect on how far I've come, I realize that the journey is far from over. I've reached a level of fluency that I once thought was impossible, but I know there's always room for improvement. I will continue to practice, learn new words, and refine my pronunciation. Learning a language is a lifelong process, and I'm ready for it. The struggles I faced along the way are no longer obstacles. They are lessons that have shaped me into a more confident speaker. I've learned that the key to mastering a language isn't just about remembering words. It's about staying committed and persistent, even when it's difficult. I still forget words from time to time, but that's okay. The most important thing is that I don't let it stop me from speaking. I'm not afraid of making mistakes anymore because I know they are part of the learning process. Looking ahead, I'm excited to continue learning and improving. I want to travel to English-speaking countries, engage in deeper conversations, and connect with people from all over the world. The opportunities are endless, and I'm ready to take them on. My journey has taught me that with determination, practice, and a willingness to learn from mistakes, anything is possible. The boy who once struggled to speak English is now someone who can communicate with confidence. And this is just the beginning. Chapter 11. Overcoming self-doubt. As my English improved, I faced a new challenge: self-doubt. Even though I could speak better than before, there were still times when I felt unsure of myself. Sometimes I would second-guess my sentences, wondering if I had said something wrong. I would think, what if they don't understand me? What if I sound silly? These thoughts would slow me down, making it hard to speak confidently. However, I reminded myself of how far I had come. I had gone from being terrified to speak to holding conversations without hesitation. I realized that no matter how many mistakes I made, the important thing was to keep going. The more I spoke, the less self-doubt I felt. One day, during a conversation with a stranger, I noticed that I wasn't worried about being perfect. I was simply enjoying the exchange. That was a breakthrough moment. I finally understood that the fear of making mistakes was worse than making the mistakes themselves. As long as I kept trying, I would continue to improve. From then on, I made a conscious effort to silence the negative thoughts. Whenever they crept in, I reminded myself that language learning is about progress, not perfection. Every mistake was just a small step toward becoming better. Slowly, I started to trust myself more. By embracing my mistakes and pushing through self-doubt, I found a new level of confidence in speaking English. It wasn't about speaking flawlessly. It was about speaking with intention and clarity. I had learned to believe in myself, and that made all the difference. Chapter 12. Exploring New Vocabulary. With my confidence growing, I decided to focus on expanding my vocabulary. I knew that to express myself more effectively, I needed to learn new words and phrases. I made it a habit to learn 5 new words every day and use them in sentences. I also kept a journal where I wrote down interesting words I came across. At first, remembering new words was challenging. Sometimes I would forget them the next day, but I didn't let it discourage me. I understood that the key was repetition. I would review the words regularly, using them in different contexts until they became second nature. One day, I realized that my vocabulary had grown significantly. I was able to have deeper conversations and express myself in ways I hadn't been able to before. Words that once felt difficult now came easily to me. I found joy in learning new expressions and using them to sound more natural. To keep things interesting, I also explored idioms and phrasal verbs. These were tricky at first, but I loved how they added flavor to my speech. They made my English sound more like that of a native speaker. I enjoyed the challenge of learning expressions that weren't always straightforward. As my vocabulary expanded, so did my ability to communicate more freely. I was no longer stuck in the same simple phrases. I could speak more creatively and effectively, and that made me feel proud. The more words I learned, the more confident I became in expressing myself. Chapter 13. Understanding Different Accents. As I continued learning English, I encountered another challenge: understanding different accents. I had gotten used to the way English was spoken in my country, but I realized that English speakers from other parts of the world sounded different. At first, this made it difficult to understand them. I remember the first time I struggled to understand someone with a strong accent. I felt embarrassed, thinking I wasn't good enough to understand English well. But I reminded myself that understanding accents was just another part of the learning process. So I decided to embrace it and improve. I started listening to podcasts and watching movies from different English-speaking countries. I made an effort to expose myself to various accents. Slowly, I began to recognize patterns and differences in pronunciation. It took time, but I started feeling more comfortable understanding people from different parts of the world. Over time, I realized that the key to understanding accents was practice and patience. I didn't need to understand every word perfectly, as long as I could get the main idea. I focused on listening actively and asking for clarification when needed. With practice, I started to feel more at ease with different accents. Being able to understand various English accents opened up new opportunities for me. I could now communicate with people from different countries and understand the nuances in their speech. It made me feel more connected to the global English-speaking community. Chapter 14: Using English in Professional Settings. As I grew more fluent in English, I began to use the language in professional settings. I remember the first time I had to speak in English at a job interview. My nerves kicked in, and I worried about making mistakes. But I reminded myself that this was an opportunity to show my skills. I took a deep breath and answered the interviewer's questions. Although I stumbled over a few words, I managed to express myself clearly. At the end of the interviewer thanked me for my effort. I didn't get the job, but the experience taught me that I could handle professional situations in English. I continued to seek out opportunities to use English at work. I participated in meetings, wrote emails, and communicated with colleagues in English. The more I used English professionally, the more comfortable I became. I was no longer intimidated by the idea of speaking in front of others. Using English in a professional environment also helped me expand my vocabulary. I learned industry-specific terms and phrases that were relevant to my job. My confidence grew as I began to understand how English was used in business contexts. By using English in professional settings, I not only improved my language skills, but also gained valuable experience. It became clear that English was an essential tool for my career growth. The more I used it, the more confident I felt in my abilities. Chapter 15: Reflecting on my journey. Now that I've come so far in my English journey, I can't help but reflect on how much I've grown. Looking back, I see a person who was once afraid to speak, worried about making mistakes, and unsure of their abilities. But today, I'm someone who speaks with confidence and isn't afraid to make mistakes. I've learned that learning a language is not just about memorizing words and grammar rules. It's about consistency, persistence, and a willingness to embrace mistakes as part of the process. Every challenge along the way has taught me something valuable. The biggest lesson I've learned is that language learning is a lifelong journey. There's always more to learn, and I'll never stop growing. Even when I forget a word or struggle with pronunciation, I know that the process of learning never ends. Looking ahead, I am excited to continue improving my English. I want to engage in even deeper conversations, write fluently, and communicate with people from all walks of life. I know that the more I use English, the more natural it will become. Reflecting on my journey, I am proud of how far I've come. The boy who once forgot every word now speaks English with confidence and clarity. And I know that this is just the beginning of an exciting and rewarding language learning adventure. Chapter 16: Embracing Cultural Differences. As I continued learning English, I realized that language wasn't just about vocabulary or grammar. It was also about understanding the culture behind the language. English is spoken by people from all over the world, and each culture brings its own expressions, traditions, and ways of thinking. I started to pay attention to the cultural aspects of the language, such as the humor, idioms, and customs associated with English-speaking countries. I found that these cultural insights not only made the language more interesting, but also helped me understand the people I was speaking with. One of the most surprising things I learned was how English could be used to express emotions and humor in unique ways. I watched TV shows and read books from different English-speaking countries, noticing how the tone, jokes, and expressions varied. This deepened my understanding of the language and made it feel even more real. I also made an effort to engage in conversations with people from different backgrounds. I learned that understanding their culture and experiences made me a better communicator. It helped me avoid misunderstandings and connect with people on a deeper level. Language is not just words. It's the bridge between cultures. Through this cultural exploration, I came to appreciate the richness and diversity of the English language. I was no longer just learning words. I was learning how to connect with people from all walks of life. This realization made me even more excited to continue my English journey. Chapter 17: Traveling and Using English. By this point in my learning, I had reached a level of fluency that made me excited to travel to English-speaking countries. I wanted to experience the language in its natural environment and challenge myself to use English in real-life situations. I booked a trip to an English-speaking country, eager to put my skills to the test. When I arrived, I was both excited and nervous. I knew I could speak English well, but I had never used it in such an immersive setting before. I quickly realized that traveling was the best way to improve my language skills. Every interaction was an opportunity to practice. From ordering food at a restaurant to asking for directions, I found that I was able to communicate with ease. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. I even made new friends who helped me improve my language skills further. It felt amazing to speak English in a real-world context, not just in the classroom. During my travels, I also discovered that English speakers were incredibly understanding and patient. Even when I made mistakes, they would smile and encourage me to keep going. This kindness gave me the confidence to keep speaking and learning. I realized that people appreciated my effort to communicate, even if I didn't always get it right. The experience of using English while traveling taught me that language learning is not just about memorizing rules. It's about connecting with others. I returned home with a new perspective on English and a deeper appreciation for how it can bring people together across cultures. Chapter 18: Using English in Writing. As I became more confident with speaking English, I realized that writing was another skill I needed to improve. I had always been more comfortable with speaking, but I knew that writing was an essential part of language proficiency. So, I began writing in English every day. At first, writing in English felt challenging. I had to think carefully about the words I used and structure my sentences correctly. But as I practiced, it became easier. I started by writing short paragraphs, then gradually worked my way up to longer essays. The more I wrote, the more natural it felt. I also found that writing helped me remember new vocabulary. When I used a word in a sentence, I would learn its meaning and proper usage. Writing allowed me to reinforce what I had learned and solidify my understanding of a language. One of the most rewarding experiences was writing a letter to a friend in English. I realized that I was able to express my thoughts and emotions clearly. The writing felt fluid, and I didn't have to stop and think for too long. It was a huge step forward, and I felt proud of my progress. I continued to write in English, whether it was keeping a journal, sending emails, or participating in online forums. Writing in English became an enjoyable way to express myself and improve my language skills. It also helped me develop a deeper understanding of grammar and sentence structure. Chapter 19: The Importance of Patience. As I reflected on my journey, I realized that one of the most important lessons I had learned was the importance of patience. Learning a language is not something that happens overnight. It takes time, effort, and consistency. There were times when I felt frustrated and wanted to give up, but I kept going because I knew that progress was slow but steady. At the beginning, I expected to speak perfectly right away, but I soon learned that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was to improve bit by bit, day by day. It was about enjoying the process and celebrating small victories along the way. Patience allowed me to embrace the ups and downs of learning. I knew that there would be moments when I would forget words or struggle to express myself, but I also knew that these moments were part of the journey. Instead of being discouraged, I learned to stay patient and keep pushing forward. There were times when I felt like I wasn't making progress, but looking back, I could see how far I had come. The key was not to focus on how much I had left to learn, but on how much I had already achieved. Patience taught me to trust the process and believe in my abilities. With patience, I had not only learned English, but had also learned how to approach challenges in life. The patience I developed while learning the language helped me become more resilient and persistent in other areas of my life as well. Chapter 20: The Journey Continues. Now, as I look back on my journey, I realize that I have achieved something I once thought was impossible. I have learned to speak, write, and understand English with confidence. But the journey doesn't end here. I know that there is always more to learn, and I'm excited to continue improving. Learning a language is not just about reaching a destination. It's about enjoying the journey. Every new word, every conversation, and every mistake is a part of the experience. I know that I will continue to make progress, and I'm ready for the challenges that lie ahead. I also know that English is not the only language I want to learn. Now that I have learned how to approach language learning, I am eager to explore other languages and cultures. The skills I've developed in learning English will help me on my journey to becoming a more global citizen. I'm grateful for every step of the way, from the struggles to the successes. Each moment has taught me something valuable, and I will carry those lessons with me as I continue to grow. English has opened many doors for me, and I'm excited to see where it will take me next. The journey may be long, but I'm no longer afraid of the challenges. I'm ready to embrace them, knowing that every step I take brings me closer to my goal. I look forward to the adventures that await me as I continue learning, exploring, and connecting with people from all over the world.